Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever your time zone may be. Welcome to the RSIS webinar, Naval Statecraft, a new framework for the new Cold War. I'm Colin, your moderator for this event. Just as a brief housekeeping, we are following the Chatham House rules, so please allow me to share a few words to set the stage. I believe the term New Cold War in this title of the webinar might have raised some eyebrows among some of you and might also have been a key motivation why you joined this webinar because it sort of sounds a little intriguing in that. And I believe there are some commentators in the past and in the present who have cautioned against the use of the term New Cold War to describe the present geopolitical as well as geoeconomic circumstances. But I'll offer that present indications seem to already point towards this direction. But as dire as this scenario may be, I believe it will be helpful to better understand this evolving situation, and hopefully we could adopt measures that could mitigate, if not prevent, potential fallout. The reality is that the current situation is one that's fraught with increasing uncertainty, never before seen, even back during the first Trump administration. Nowhere is this uncertainty felt even more greatly than in the maritime domain. The world continues to heavily rely on seaborne trade, yet geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics continue to evolve in this domain. We have maritime flashpoints across the Indo-Pacific waters in particular, and we have shifts in global supply chains which heavily rely on those critical sea lines of communications, and these create grounds for security concern. So, for example, the recent Trump administration policies, including the increase in fees for Chinese-built vessels to dock at US seaports, have been unprecedented and closely watched after by the maritime community and beyond. So in this context of growing geopolitical and geoeconomic uncertainty, it begs the question how countries in the Indo-Pacific could anticipate, prevent, and mitigate against potential shocks. With that, I'm very honored to have Captain Brent Sadler to join us for this webinar to shed light on the new framework of naval statecraft for the United States, which will allow us to ponder more deeply those policy issues that bear potential ramifications upon all of us. I believe all of you will have had already looked at Brent's extensive credentials in his bio. Customarily, as a moderator, I will have to read out in full, but please let me share my personal introduction of Brent, both as a friend and a fellow think tanker. I know Brent for a while, though that came first as my initial understanding of his long list of scholarly work touching on naval issues and related geopolitics focused on this part of the world. Brent is a naval officer, a veteran submariner, in fact, who served his tours in the Pacific. And for those of you who might not know, the silent service is never one of the most enviable naval vocations amongst all. Yet Brent went beyond his tour as a maritime practitioner and also embarked on extensive diplomatic stints in the region, including Southeast Asia. As such, Brent is no stranger to this part of the world, and his deep knowledge of naval affairs and regional geopolitical issues is something that will be of immense value to our discussion here. All in all, Brent is a naval officer, a naval diplomat, a naval thinker, and a naval strategist. Hence, I would like to express my gratitude to Brent for taking time off your evening to share your views with us. I'm sure we'll benefit greatly from this discussion with you. With that, the floor is all yours, Brent.
Thank you very much, Colin. And it's great to be amongst old friends again. And for those of you out there who I have not met, greetings and good morning, Singapore. I'm out here in Washington, D.C. later in the evening, but very sharp and awake and looking forward to learn from you all through your questions at the end of the presentation. But we are, as they say, in interesting times, and history never really truly repeats, but it does rhyme. And the key thing with as Colin was talking about, the framing of a new Cold War is not to repeat the mistakes and the misjudgments of the last Cold War, but at the same time understand that what we are facing today is fundamentally different than the competition that was between the West, principally the United States, and on the other side, led by the Soviet Union. It's a very different competition, but it is global in scale and it is comprehensive. And so there has been wide-running debate here in Washington, D.C., but I think in the last year, maybe year and a half, the consensus is the best or the easiest framing from the American perspective and political understandings is to call what we're facing now a new Cold War. Some will have differences of opinion on that, but that's not the main focus here. So let me go ahead and turn on my slides. So give me 1 second. All right, I think I've got those up. Please let me know if you cannot see those. Colin, are we good? All right. So this is just the title slide. Again, kind of the framing, but to kind of set the context that in this new Cold War kind of era, and with a rich network of partners and allies, many common shared interests, both economic, culturally, and also in national security, the place in which where those differences might arise that could put that at risk, where we have the most in common and where we can work the most together is at sea. And this is one of the core assumptions that kind of is the center point of this naval statecraft idea. So you may have seen the abstract statement in the notice that was passed out. I've highlighted the term naval statecraft, and I'll get to this later as to exactly what it is and how it's defined, but also from a practical perspective. And again, I will highlight that it really has its genesis in the experiences in Southeast Asia, most notably the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. But the central assumption is that statecraft, our collective statecraft, Singapore's, Japan's, America's, all are not fitted to this new challenge, this new Cold War that we're in today. And a change is necessary. So the first thing as we start to dive into this discussion that I want to kind of frame is from the American perspective. And that is, where is Americans' interest most at risk, and how do Americans perceive this new Cold War? And it's really the foundation on which, why a new framework, a naval statecraft framework, is necessary. The first is, what is the purpose of a maritime approach, or a naval force for that matter? And that is, and it goes back to Alfred Thayer Mahan and Corbett's theorist, that navies exist to assure access to markets and influence events on land for political ends. And that is perhaps the best summation of books upon books upon books as to the purpose of navies. And it's a core kind of principle going forward in this discussion. The picture on the upper right is the sea lanes, critical choke points, etc. It's the world as it is. It's the trade patterns and the global economy that the United States is a part of and also reliant on. Singaporeans know this very well as many of America's closest allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia. These are the lifeblood of our prosperity, but our security. But this is also held at risk. The green that you see on that lower map, these are natural disaster from earthquakes to tsunamis, typhoons, that the U.S. military has, for domestic political reasons, of course, but also national security reasons, had to respond. These are the natural disasters. The red circles that you see on there, the 5 of those, these are the flashpoints of potential major conflict, state on state. The most important one right there, currently under a lot of scrutiny here in Washington, D.C., is that circle around Taiwan. But the most important part of this lower map that I want to draw people's attention to are the 2 yellow or golden areas, one in the Eastern Mediterranean and the other that's in the South China Sea. These are the decisive theaters. This is where the interest of the United States, the majority of its closest security partners and allies, but also it's the principal adversaries in this new Cold War competition. Russia, but principally China, Chinese Communist Party, to be specific, have also deep entrenched interest. So these are the places to focus and to preferably control the tempo, the scope, and the potential, keep activities safely inside bounds without it spreading more widely and out of control across the world. So the decisive theaters, these are maritime decisive theaters. So why is it, and why do I assert that American statecraft has failed? And I won't get into others and judge others' statecraft in a deeper specific. I am more focused in on America's failures of the past 20 years or so in a statecraft that has been not appropriate to this new environment that we find ourselves in. And so since 2012 to today, there are numerous failures of diplomacy, military responses, etc. But the 2020 West Kapala crisis between Chinese forces and Malaysia doing exploratory surveys in its own waters was a textbook case of what naval statecraft could look like when done well. And it rallied at the end of it, as I'll show on later. It actually had a galvanizing impact, but it was an interesting, unique synthesis of naval presence, diplomacy, all backed by a clear understanding of common and shared economic interest at the same times. But there are institutional issues in the American experience that are also at play that have to change. The way our government is structured is not up to the challenge also. The next is, with that problem statement, so to speak, the American maritime reality is really best captured in these two pictures. The one on the left is some would call the tyranny of distance. Many of those flashpoints are far away from the United States, but economically and diplomatically, for our prosperity in the continental United States, those flashpoints are very close and very real. But to respond, if you were to move from military force to backup diplomacy, you're talking weeks to respond. The blue circles I'll draw your attention to is if the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal were blocked or became impassable, the added time for the U.S. to move adequate military forces becomes extremely prolonged. The picture on the right is not up to date, but it shows, if you look at the table at the bottom, a trend of U.S. military forces, notably naval in this case, from the Indian Ocean into the Western Pacific and into the Mediterranean and into the North Atlantic from June of 2021 to June of 2023. And as we know, Hamas's attack against Israel in October of 2023 created a return to a previous norm that has not been helpful in a greater strategic context of deterring Chinese behavior in the Western Pacific, and certainly not deterring Russian aggression in Europe. And so we're seeing what some would call a strategic lack of discipline of naval forces returning to the Indian Ocean region, principally to respond to the Houthis and to Iranian activities against Israel and supporting of its proxies and attacks, ongoing attacks against Israel. The reason for that is a deep-seated, and it's political in the United States, but it's not the focus, not the reason is not the issue. The effect is what's important. And so there has to be some kind of discipline to ensure appropriate focus where it matters most. And naval forces can move and they can stay in a region for a long time once they get there, unlike Army or Air Force units. Well, this begs the question, when the United States is facing multiple challenges, how to balance that. And it's effectively great power multitasking. The war in Ukraine, of course, drew a lot of military forces to bolster deterrence in Europe. It could have detracted from the naval presence in the Western Pacific, but it didn't, because the European theater was principally land-based. But that started to change when the Houthis entered into the fray after the October 7th attack. So there's a lot here, and I would say part of it is structural, but the problem is not one that is strictly an American problem. I think all countries have to multitask numerous challenges to their national security and their economic interest. But this little caricature in the bottom kind of captures, I think, at the top of the issue for the United States is trying to balance a very competent and very globally dispersed Chinese Communist Party and increasingly a Russia that is in league or actually at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party, working together to pressurize and move against American interests specifically, but our shared Western and democratic governments and open markets more generally. So that's call, and there is no easy answer to this, and there never will be. But the next level down in this is when it comes to the questions of, okay, well, what forces do you need? Where do you need to be postured? The goal is deterrence. The goal is to prevent what would be perhaps the bloodiest war that the world would see, at least since the Pacific War or World War II. And the way the United States is finding it has to respond to a very large air and missile armory or arsenal that's in mainland China, as well as a very large and modern navy, is they have to operate from range and surge forces in. Some of this is also in the recent years moving inside the first island chain with Army and Marine Corps units to complicate the Chinese military planning and operations. This might be the way we fight. It may not be after the first contact, but deterrence is based on the understanding in your adversary's mind that you have a competent and also present military force that can actually complicate and potentially defeat their military plans. And so deterrence relies on this. The grim reality of the world as we see it, and again, why we have to focus in on changing our statecraft, because the goal is deterrence. The urgency for this is some, and we can talk in Q&A, is the 2027 moment of greatest strategic risk. Many Chinese Communist Party plans, dialogues, prioritization of investments, the increased aggressiveness of their military operations all back up that there's a preparation and a posturing of their military for a showdown this decade. Many here in DC see that, and they put a point on the calendar as 2027. Debatable, yes, but there is a lot of due diligence behind that. And it gives the urgency for changing the way that we do business in all of our different countries and the way we approach and to keep this Cold War cold. The Chinese have spent the better part of the last 30 years building a navy and a rocket force designed to take on the US Navy and its allies like Japan and Taiwan. And you can see since 2015, their modern navy has actually outsized the US Navy in its totality. But of course, if you add in allies, this does cause some concern and does have a deterrent effect. But the value of allies and partners in true lethal military collective action becomes not a good thing, it becomes a necessary thing to maintain the peace. The final part of this, and this is for those that may watch the US Navy, is the U.S. Navy was built largely in the Cold War, the last Cold War. And many of those ships are now reaching the end of their life, and there has not been a rapid enough buildup to replace those ships. And there is no avoiding a decrement in the firepower that the U.S. Navy can put to sea. So this also argues for a change in the way that we operate and the way that we behave. Of course, technology can offer some solutions, but until proven in combat, you're never going to be able to bet enough on it, and an adversary is not going to be deterred by technology alone. New ways of logistics, the lower there in the left, to what we saw in the Black Sea, that's the former Russian Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, sunk by a combination of drones operated by Ukrainians over the Black Sea and shore-based launched anti-ship cruise missiles, the Neptune. Of course, the balloon up there, that was during World War II, U.S. Navy used for hunting German and Japanese submarines, but mostly in the Atlantic, but could also see a return, but in other missions. And then down the picture from World War II, a floating dry dock that kept U.S. ships able to fight. This is going to be critical when you have a small and aging Navy that can't be replaced in the war. We're going to need to have more options of repairing ships that are damaged and getting them back to sea and in the fight quickly. Again, there is a lot that we have as allies and partners that can make this very quickly a reality. But technology can help these things. It's not the solution by itself.
Hey, Brent.
Yep.
Brent, were you able to pull up the slides?
Oh, yeah. Oh, they're not showing?
Yeah, I thought you might be aware that it wasn't showing. So
Oh, no, I didn't
Yeah.
see that. I'm sorry.
yeah.
That was very strange. Is it showing now?
Okay. Great, finally.
Okay.
Yes.
Very sorry for that.
No
Let's see. Let me
problem.
move this.
But you have largely, spoke about all those things. So I think the slides are just secondary for our illustration. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
No worries. So on this slide, this is where we're getting to the meat of the matter anyway. And I think the slides can be made available to everyone that's that's watching today. So what is the definition of naval statecraft? There's three elements of it. And the idea goes back to some work that I started in 2010 for the White House and also for the Chief of Naval Operations at the time. Deep background kind of stuff. Some of this work became what was to be known as the rebalance to the Asia Pacific. And then it was things and ideas that were put into practice and refined through actual implementation in my many assignments and my jobs, and then published, with a little bit more academic rigor in my most recent book in May of 2023, U.S. Naval Power. And it's also been embraced by the former Chief of Naval Operations. He had called it maritime statecraft for political reasons to make it less military. But there's three elements. Proactive forward naval presence. That's the West Kapala in the background in the picture on the left with a U.S. littoral combat ship nearby. This we'll talk more about, and as I mentioned already, is a key moment in the awareness of this new statecraft. The next is a case study looking at the economic benefits of military presence and security, like creating a bubble in which an economy can grow and mature. This is with Djibouti. So if you go back to the day September 10th, 2001, before the attacks against the United States by Al-Qaeda, there were about 100 to 200 French Foreign Legion and a base that was being closed at Fort Le Menier in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. The GDP, the economy of the country was minuscule. The U.S. had very little trade and any kind of economic exchange with Djibouti. That all changed rapidly when the U.S. Special Forces flowed in to try to intercept Al-Qaeda fleeing Afghanistan into Somalia and other places like Yemen. Over the years, that built up. Economic needs started to grow as The base took on greater physical size and scale, the need for fuel, the need for food, the need for people to do repair, maintaining the facilities there. That wasn't just U.S. personnel doing that. And so you started to see second and third order effects. Trade, economic development started to take off. And that's what you see in the bottom. On the right, you can see the imports and exports between the U.S. and Djibouti. And you can see how it grew. And it's beneficial to both sides. Lesser to the United States because of scale of the economy, but certainly Djibouti. It also attracted the Japanese and the Chinese. It's the only place where the Chinese and the Japanese have a base outside of their home countries. Ostensibly, for the Japanese, this was to go after piracy. The PLA shows up after the piracy problem was largely basically addressed and put into basically minimized. But they still have a very sizable presence in Djibouti. And that, again, of course, developed into rail lines and road lines into Ethiopia, further energizing the economy in the Horn of Africa. The final part is a study that was done in 2015 and 16 to try to put numbers to the base or the forward presence and its economic effects. And what was found is if you cut the military presence, either soldiers, airmen, ships in a country, a host country, to include even agreements, treaties, MOUs, memos of understanding, all of those things, if you cut that in half, you would actually have a significant drop in trade. The tune in 2015 of about 450 billion US dollars. Today, that would be closer to about 660 billion US dollars today. If the US cut half of its overseas presence and its obligations or treaties with other countries. But it also goes in the other direction. And I'll get to that later. But the point of this slide is naval presence connected to a host nation and with agreements as well can have a mutually beneficial, not just security, but economic benefit. This was never consciously considered or embraced and is only just now starting to be embraced here in DC. So let's talk about the West Kapala incident a little bit now and go through the lessons, at least from my perspective, what I saw. And again, this is from an American's viewpoint and also how the United States can better employ its national treasure more effectively to deter a potential major war, specifically in Asia. The key observations in this timeline is that the West Kapala really starts back in December of 2019 as the Malaysian survey vessel was being harassed by Chinese maritime militia and other Chinese Coast Guard vessels. This was also an election year in Taipei, in Taiwan. One of those events that become very tense between Beijing and DC. The third Taiwan crisis, which occurred in the 90s, 97, is something that was a watershed event for military planners and the Chinese Communist Party. So there was a sizable U.S. naval presence that was in the Western Pacific, not because of West Kapala, but to signal to Beijing that we were very concerned and wanted to ensure that peace continued through the elections in Taipei. It looked like to the Chinese, however, as their harassment was ongoing into April and May, that the U.S. presence was actually being more directed at their antagonistic activities. Again, it wasn't necessarily the intent, wasn't the design of the U.S. forces, but Beijing's perception is what matters. And then there was a public statement, a very unusual one, by the 7th Fleet Admiral based in Japan, who was the overall authority for all of these activities. And Admiral Merce, the commander at the time, had said, when questioned, that the U.S. Navy's presence was there as well to ensure the economic rights of our partners in the region, as well as to ensure U.S. national security interest. And that economic, that very explicit connection to the rights of countries in the region, many in dispute with China, had a galvanizing effect. It was a new message, but it was most importantly backed up by months, well, a couple months before, of a persistent and very real naval presence. So those words mattered. And everyone started to connect this, and eventually even in DC. And I found out talking to many of the practitioners, senior leaders, that it was not the plan. There was no plan to do this. It happened about largely by luck. And the luck part of this was the Secretary of State at the time had earlier, as early as January of 2020, had planned a major policy speech that was going to declare that Chinese excessive claims were illegal. Had that occurred before all of this, and at least my understanding of the sentiments in Southeast Asia is that it would have had a chilling effect. It would have made the United States look more like an antagonistic force, not one supporting their economic interest and rights in the disputed waters of the South China Sea. But the sequence, the sustained military presence, all came together. And I don't have the polls, but there were polls that were done just before in the region, and there were polls that were done just after. This was done by ASEAN, and you could see a very positive, large upswing in support of the United States as a partner of choice, both for economics, which was surprising for me, but also a doubling, like from 32% favorable to 60% favorable of the United States several months after the end of the West Kapala incident. So why does this matter? And this is more of a slide that I use to explain to those not from the region. Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines all have significant numbers of people whose livelihood and welfare derives directly from the South China Sea, from seabed resources like petroleum to fish, amongst other things. I also put Prosper Africa in there as a program that was focused in on small and medium enterprises. Think fishing villages, think small vessels going out and doing support for offshore infrastructure or moving supplies to outlying islands. This is a place where the United States saw great success for a while in Africa. Similarly, playing and connecting into the maritime or nautical needs of our partners is also, if it's tied to the economics, can have a security benefit. This is the naval presence merging into the developmental economics that are one of the basis, the pillars of naval statecraft. Here's another table of what I was explaining earlier about the RAND study. The key thing is that it also reverses it. If you cut the presence, you can have a significant drop in trade, but it also goes the other way. If you double, and it's not just soldiers and ships and aircraft that are being hosted in another country, it's also the agreements. And really at the end of it, it's trust. It's really a security and an understanding between two countries that trade agreements and diplomatic understandings are based on real tangible things. And that, when you really kind of get to it, is very much based in very simple and easy to understand human nature. But it's worth making the case because it's not something that normally informs, at least not in Washington, D.C., the formulation and the execution of grand strategy, diplomatic initiatives, and economic investments. So I earlier mentioned that there's structural problems. This is one small piece of it. And Singapore kind of sits on a gold mine of its geographic location strategically. It really is at the center of many, many things. That's both a blessing and a curse. Folks in Singapore know this, and I don't need to explain why and how. But the U.S. military, again, is too thin to be everywhere that it needs to be. And it has to focus, and it has to be operating in a way that's much more appropriate to the regions that it's going to operate in. And I think the number one most important of these maritime regions is Southeast Asia for maintaining deterrence and keeping this new Cold War cold. Again, that's the objective. And too often, at least the critical element of the maritime, and it's not just Navy ships, it's Marines, it's Army units that are also coming out and doing exercises in new formed regiments, multi-domain operations, MDO regiments, and Marine Corps littoral operations. It's all of these things. But there isn't a command structure that really kind of provides structure to that in a sustained day-to-day way. The Navy right now in the 7th Fleet's based in Japan. It has its hands full watching the Russians and deterring them and making sure to meet treaty obligations to Japan's defense, as well as mutual defense treaty with South Korea against looking across to North Korea. Two very dangerous adversaries. And of course, 7th Fleet is the one that's looking and planning and making sure that its forces are ready to respond should a war occur over the fate of Taiwan. That's a lot. There's very little bandwidth, time, and energy to try to engage in a peacetime competition that is both positive for our partners in Southeast Asia, at the same time delicately ensuring the type of deterrence that will be effective in building a status quo that ensures the rights of all the partners in the region. That is why one of the things that I've been calling for a long time is a first fleet. And we can talk more about in the Q&A what that is. Some may recall that follow this idea was announced by during the first President Trump's administration in the final months of his term by the Secretary of the Navy. The idea is still very much alive, but it is not as solid as like where it would be home ported, what ship would it be based on. There's a lot more fungibility or flexibility into how that would come about. And again, it has to be done in a way that is acceptable to our partners in the region, because that is one of the principal audiences and partners in it. But the U.S. Navy, for the reasons I've given before, cannot keep doing business as it has been and still ensure deterrence. Finally, to end on a bang, and then before we turn over to questions, I do want to conclude and say again, thank you. I apologize, the slides, I couldn't see that they weren't up there. Again, please reach out. I'll get those to you so you can see the ones that I was talking over. But this idea of a naval statecraft or a maritime statecraft is gaining traction here. And I think it's important to where input from countries such as Singapore and others is heard in DC is very important, as we are in the early stages of this new Cold War. And I think it's important that we make sure it's not a repeat of the last one, and that we have a much more positive approach to this of basic human natures of competition between countries. And that most importantly, that we keep it peaceful. So with that, let me go ahead and turn these slides off. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brent. Sorry about this. I thought we could intervene by putting up the slides on your behalf, but we have yet to receive it. So very sorry about this. And my apologies as well to the audiences for this technicality issue. Now, we are now into the Q&A, and also as mentioned in the, in sort of housekeeping rules that you see, you could put in your questions, your comments into the box. And what I'm trying to do here, now that we have quite good time, we have like, up to say 50 minutes or so for a Q&A. We could possibly sort of group those questions according to themes, and then we'll address those questions accordingly. So, while some of you are thinking about questions and typing in this, the sort of thing that I also encounter in my class as well, when I teach, I need to give them some time to sort of think about it, while I sort of chime in a little bit more with what I had taught earlier. So with that, maybe let me just shoot off the first question. Since Brent, you sort of gave an open invitation about the first fleet idea, and I remember back then, I was keeping track of this, and it was very tantalizing when it first came out from then Secretary of Navy Brett Wade, right? When he said that, it actually triggered quite a bit of reaction from the region as well. And as quickly as the proposal came, and as quickly it went away with the first Trump administration. So if I could, sort of ask you to share a bit more about the prospect of the First Fleet being sort of reinvigorated as an idea and how feasible in terms of its implementation? Are there any potential pitfalls that we have to keep a lookout for? And what are those potential ramifications that you anticipate for the region itself?
Yeah, no. So the genesis of this was in the summer of 2020. I had written something called a small paper that introduced the idea of decisive theaters. My understanding of the Russians, my understanding of the Chinese strategy and their national interest, and why these two places were critically important, and how the Navy was not postured. That triggered a conversation that was, it never really got very far, but it was, with the Secretary of the Navy. And I think elections have consequences. He didn't have the time to develop it, but the Secretary of the Navy wanted to get the idea out there so that people could chew on it, think about it, adapt it, modify it to be appropriate. In my mind, it's still very valid. The Navy, I think, didn't quite fully understand either, and there was some resistance internally. That's from the U.S. side, and of course from Southeast Asia, the reaction was extremely predictable. I mean, I had, let's say, sharp words to some of that. It's important not to surprise our partners in Southeast Asia with a pronouncement first. It's better to have quiet, informal discussions and then just do it. But the politics and the way DC operates, there wasn't that luxury, sadly, because if it wasn't made in the region and the announcement didn't have a reaction, it would have never resonated in DC. So that negative experience also made sure that it stuck in people's minds. An unfortunate reality of American politics. But the idea is not dead. It's still, again, the necessity for it is unchanged. In fact, it's probably sharper. What it isn't is not a new base. Again, this is why I like the maritime part. Ships get underway. You don't have to have a giant infrastructure in someone's country to have a first fleet. You don't even have to have a lot of ships. You're not going to get a lot because the U.S. Navy doesn't have the ships to do this. But back in my time in KL, the 7th Fleet Admiral's flagship, the USS Blue Ridge, had to go to the shipyard for, I think it was a year and a half. And there was a deployment that they were planning to Southeast Asia, specifically to do staff talks throughout the region and exercises. So the Admiral shifted his flag. It's a naval term. He shifted his headquarters to one of the EPFs. These are one of the logistics ships that are very familiar in the waters around Singapore. And so they turned this into a temporary flagship. And they operated in the South China Southeast Asia for, I think, 3 to 6 months, if my memory recall. I think certainly 3 months that I was engaged with him as the defense attaché in Malaysia in shaping all of these engagements. So that is probably what this would look like. It still has concerns because some will view it as a militarization, looking for bases and building. Only if host countries want it to be. It's not necessary. But ships need to go to port and get fuel and pick up food. There certainly hasn't been many places in the region that have just said, we don't want any U.S. warships at all. We don't, just go somewhere else to get your food and fuel. There hasn't really been that reaction. So again, it's a partnership. The tempo, the scale of this has to be tuned to what is acceptable and what is welcomed. Now, further south in Australia, there's also the need to develop the nuclear submarine program with the Australians. So First Fleet has a secondary function to help that along as well. And again, having a 3-star admiral, which is U.S. normal rank for a numbered fleet, would give the type of visibility and the attention and the resources to make sure that that also stays on track. So these are the two things that a First Fleet would, in my mind, focus in on. Of course, those two things can also be viewed as in competition for each other. because there's not very many ships. But again, an EPF, one of these logistics ships, is not nuclear, so it doesn't have to go to Australia. The admiral can go down to Sterling, where this effort is underway in Australia, and oversee some of the visits and the growing U.S.-Australian nuclear submarine partnership. But the principal focus is South China Sea. That could also cause some consternation because not all of the countries in the region see the maritime dispute with China the same way. Again, it's offshore, it's at sea. It's a partnership that can be as visible as welcomed by the host country. And that's an important thing. Not easy to explain and to keep the discipline on the U.S. side, because that's not how the U.S. normally operates. I'm very familiar with both sides of this equation. But I think with the current admiral at 7th Fleet, the current admiral in Hawaii at Indo-PACOM, who I know both very well, and perhaps the new Secretary of the Navy and certainly the new White House, I think you've got the right temperament to make sure that the right footprint, the right presence is there and done in a way that has the deterrent effect, but also the attractive effect to folks in the region. So I hope I didn't talk too long, but I think it's very important that the U.S. is not going to surge in a huge number of sailors and soldiers, and they're going to go look for like some new headquarters in someone's capital. That's not what this is at all.
Yeah, thank you, Brent, for this very elaborate discussion about the First Fleet. I remember our conversation. I thought that was very interesting when you first picked up the idea about sort of a floating headquarters of some sort that will, sort of circumvent the political sensitivities about physical basing, permanent stationing of troops and whatnot. It sort of makes it more flexible. I wanted to make use of this opportunity to sort of dovetail into one of two questions that I believe are very relevant as a follow-up to our discussion here. And I have to seek all our audience pardon if I could address you by your first name for simplicity. So the first will be Haridas, who is also our colleague in RSIS, because I thought his question is quite directly relevant to the earlier discussion we had. He was asking whether Trump's insistence that U.S. allies to pick up the tab for U.S. forward presence in the world, including in the Pacific, will that therefore diminish its military commitment to this part of the world? So I think this is related to what we discussed earlier. So Brent, if you could shed light on this point.
Yeah, most of the consternation from DC and Trump's words are very direct. I think it's easy to understand, and I think that's a testament. I think that's actually welcomed by many. And many of the people that I come in touch, it's not a question where he stands. It's very easy to understand. It's like most of the consternations with NATO countries that have not spent for their military. And the result of that is that Putin has not been deterred. And then when the time came to supply weapons and to support Ukraine so they could survive, but then to try to turn the tide and end this war, there was not enough weapons. There wasn't any military inventory that they could gift to Ukraine to end the war. And so we're in this, well, there wasn't any vision or leadership also ostensibly, but when it came to like tanks and aircraft, weapons and missiles, decades of underinvestment. And for the Germans, it was scary because they did not have the ability to field a military that could have stopped the Russians. So it was a wake-up call. Most of the consternation, most of that is directed at Europe. Some of it does go towards the South Koreans and the Japanese, but when you start to look at what really is the point, and again, it's not, don't focus in on the words that are coming out of the White House. Look at what the words are intended to elicit as a reaction. One is perhaps it's more energy and action in military operations together. Maybe it is you need spending more money on your own defense, not host nation support necessarily. And I think when you look at countries in the Western Pacific, many have been very much aware of the changed strategic environment going back 15 years, and their defense budgets reflect that. Japan is on a trajectory of spending, I think, going on to certainly exceeded 1% of GDP, which was a cap for much of its post-war history. South Korea is certainly spending a lot more on its defense, needs to spend more. Both of them need to spend more. But the point is, they know it, and politically, they're doing it. Taiwan, until the last few years under Tsai Ing-wen, she actually, in her leadership, basically started to address a lot of concerns in DC of trying to have a military that could fight against the Chinese and deter them long enough, or at least hold them at bay long enough for support to show up. But not all the countries are spending what they should be for the dangers they face. And so I think you're probably going to hear that from the administration. It's still going to, but again, it's focus less on the words and what is the output that's being sought. Sometimes it's, hey, we know that your country cannot do more in the military, but you can do a lot more perhaps to address these security concerns over in the economic realm. And it's to open up a very easy to understand discussion. It's American diplomacy by a businessman. It's very different. It's very straightforward. And I think easier to understand because it's rooted in a realist framework of what's in our national interest. So, and the understanding is when you understand two countries understand what their national interest, it's easier to come to an understanding than when you start looking at principles and you try to look at partnering, it becomes very hard to understand. And I have stories about trying to explain that when people couldn't understand what is America's real interest in something. So anyway, I'll stop there.
I think that point is,
yep.
oh, I think that point
Yeah,
seems also quite relevant to our discussion when it comes to, the regional sentiments about U.S. commitments. And, I think there's some sort of a trepidation when it comes to, whether the U.S. will remain committed to the region. And, in that, people tend to compare with what is going on over in Europe, for example. And I think that I think those concerns are in a way quite understandable in that because very often what happens in other parts of the world can become key lessons for us to sort of pour into what the current administration is thinking about, and people try to anticipate and make necessary adjustments here and there. So on that point, I think another question that was being listed here by one of our students in RSIS, Alex. He was actually trying to sort of compare the context here because the last Cold War was won by the West. It was a completely different context back then, but now the context is somewhat different, right? We have, of course, sort of weakened Russia ever since the war in Ukraine, and I think we are seeing, increasingly stronger China when it comes to various aspects, despite its ongoing domestic issues. But China is still a strong power in itself, and of course, as to mention, what's happening right now in the Middle East and in Asia. I think we have countries who are trying to sort of play the very tough balancing act between their ties with China and the US. So in that sense, I guess, what will be the buy-in in that? How is it possible to try to convince regional allies and partners on the feasibility of, the new approach in dealing with all these issues that you highlighted earlier?
Yeah. So from my point, in my position, I've tried to move American understandings away of trying, not trying to convince others what they should do or why the American approach is what they should adopt, but rather to clearly articulate what's in the U.S. interest and then to share the insights, the intelligence in some cases of what we're seeing, and to then let those partner countries and allies assess and adjust and come back and say, here's how we can work together, or here's our common threat perception. It's never 100% in alignment. And it does change. But that's a subtle kind of like a way in which you execute the diplomacy. And it's a change in the way American diplomacy military strategy has been executed in the past. It's changing. It's a better understanding and an affinity for regional sensitivities. Knowing our allies, we have to rely on our allies. As I mentioned earlier, it's not a nicety anymore. It's a vital necessity. So when it comes to, from that perspective, I think the Chinese Communist Party, and I single them out. I try not to say China because there is a lot there. It's a huge country, lots of different interests. There's regional, there's all kinds of, there's a lot of things going on there. But the Chinese Communist Party, a Marxist-Leninist construct, my reading of history and my understanding of Marxism is it's a very brittle system. It's a very insecure system. And it's prone to aggression to secure its legitimacy. And I think you see this with the Chinese Communist Party at the same time. And I think that's driven much of the Chinese Communist Party since 2019 to do very self-destructive diplomatic and military activities that, quite frankly, are alienating and scaring many countries across the world, to include those in Europe, through its economic bad behaviors. They've also, in the last 5 or 6 years, the business environment in China is also atrocious. It's highly politicized and very dangerous for foreign businesses to do business, to basically set up shop in China for a host of reasons. So they're doing it to themselves. They're alienating themselves. The Chinese Communist Party has to change on its own. The best thing for the rest of us to do is to make sure that the military option, the more violent tendencies of these Marxist-Leninist regimes, is kept in check. And I have a high degree of confidence that that can be achieved because of the nature, again, of the Chinese Communist Party. They're very risk adverse. So there's an opportunity there, but it requires working together in some new ways. And those new ways are where we have to try to have a discussion. The First Fleet is an example of one of those that I think would be a great test case for changing the dynamic. But I think it's also worth noting that the last Cold War, in World War II, the Soviet Union was, an enemy for the first 2 years, and then it was an ally. And from the Americans' perspective, it was never an enemy, it was always an ally. And there had been a lot of ideological seepage into the US culture and governance. There was the Red Scare of the 50s, which may not be something that folks in Singapore may not be familiar with, and purges of actual communist sympathizers and those that were working on the behest of the Soviet Union that were in the US government and the military. And so I don't think you're going to see something like that, like a purge going through in the US culture. But there is an awakening that's occurring that China's United Front work, which I'm sure many are familiar with United Front as the Chinese Communist Party's tool for subversion. It's becoming very much aware broadly in the United States and other countries. And so there's a look internally and also to kind of help each other to try to get that negative influence out of our systems and out of our economies. And that's important. I think very important. I think there's an effort there. And I think that's Australia back in 2017 had series of very significant criminal cases of Chinese communist influence paying politicians in support of their campaigns. It was a wake-up call to them that the influence from a foreign power that didn't share their interests or their values was directly influencing and tweaking their own politics and the decisions that their policymakers were making, contrary to Australians' people's better interest. So I think that view is also important to understand as an undercurrent to this new Cold War. It was similar to 1948, to the Berlin crisis, and I think we're not at a Korean War moment, and maybe we never will. I hope we never do have that type of galvanizing event that created NATO and that forced a went to like a detente-ish kind of world where still our economies and our peoples were still kind of interconnected a little bit, um, to becoming a very separated, polarized Cold War. We're not at that stage yet, but we're one military confrontation or a crisis away from that happening. And then the trajectory can change from this new Cold War to something that's more like the last one. But again, it's important to note, no matter what the collective we do, the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing ultimately also decides.
Well, I think this is a very interesting point that you raised because I think right now, I mean, if based on the neoliberalist way of looking at how international politics works, the more interdependence you have, then you reduce the risk of a conflict. But what we are seeing now appears to be a trajectory of the opposite, right? Whereby we're looking at ongoing efforts to decouple. And I was wondering, at what point of time we have to be alarmed because this decoupling on various fronts, both the economic front, the technological front, could one day lead to a situation where the so-called Cold War will no longer become just a Cold War, but it will potentially bring it into a sort of a hot war going forward. So this is one question I have, but I wanted to make use of the opportunity to sort of bring in this the relevant question that is being raised by Saranya. About the sort of interlinkages between trade and security, because as we may know now, these days we have been talking about the discourse on geoeconomics, whereby all the existing economic issues like the tariffs and all that are all increasingly securitized. We could not really see the sort of clear bifurcation between simply trade or simply security. I think everything now is sort of all jumbled together. So Brent, how do you envision the trade war between the China and the US, and how will that influence strategic thinking in Asia? Maybe you might not want to deal with whole Asia because Asia is a huge continent with many different countries and interests, but you may want to scope it according to your best understanding. Yeah.
So yeah, there's a couple points. One, the last Cold War, just to address one thing, the point that you made, Colin, up front. We went from, we kind of separated into two separate spheres. We had proxy wars in the last Cold War. It never really turned into a major confrontation because we were able to deter the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union deterred us, quite frankly. It was mutual assured destruction was a thing. And this is why we have to buy time to ensure that we can reassert deterrence. I'm not confident, judging by how the Chinese Communist Party behaves and its military, the PLA operates at sea and in the air in the Western Pacific, that they're deterred. So it's very dangerous. We have to find a way to buy time to bit that military power to get the deterrence back. On the economic side of things, the decoupling, again, I think this is an awareness that the Chinese Communist Party is a command economy. Even though they may be members of the WTO, they do not meet the standards and the terms of which their entry into the WTO was agreed. They have never lived up to it. So they are not playing fair. And that's a detriment to all open economies, or those that strive to be. The United States, I think now the damage has become so pronounced, and the danger from a very strong China is very clear to many Americans, not just the elites and the business blue collar American, Main Street Americans, as we call them. It's very relevant. They feel it, they see it, they understand it. Not unlike the Soviets in the Cold War. There's this awakening to it. But yeah, the economics, the challenge there and the decoupling of it is to work together. Some will call it fringe shoring. Some will call it like reshoring to the United States. What's become very clear because of the Chinese Communist Party and a command economy is that they frequently steal the intellectual property as part of the deal of doing business in China. Uh, that has now got to a point in many cases, they don't need to operate that anymore. They don't need that. So they don't need foreign companies in China anymore. So the lucrativeness is diminished. And because of Xi Jinping since 2019's crackdowns and then COVID policies and its hyper politicization that's going on has made the business environment also not conducive. So there's capital flight already just happening because business makes sense to go out. Now, that's not to say you can still have entry into the market and sell products there, though that's becoming also somewhat challenging. But certainly what you're not seeing is a lot more capital investments. Building factories, Elon Musk's recent, few years ago, Tesla kind of set that aside. The trend has been for years to move to other countries for a host of reasons, out of China. And even the Chinese are following that into South Asia, like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all the other places. And India, of course, is one of the big ones that gets a lot of attention in the United States, but it's not the only one. So this is a necessary, I think, reality, because if you have all of your production, let's take microelectronics and rare earth, not the mining of the rare earths, but the processing. They're not really rare. It's just they're really dirty and caustic to produce. And no one really wants to do that because the environmental. So they do it, they process them in China. It really doesn't have the same kind of standards for processing caustic materials in large scale. So even though mining of the rare earths is starting to diversify, still almost all, like a massive amount, I think upwards of 70 or 80% now, is processed in China. And that has a military use. It has a top tier economic use. Goes into the next thing I want to talk about, which has gotten a lot of attention in the United States the last 6 years, microelectronics. Gallium is one of the things that the Chinese started to put limits on. And I think they're actually turning off any exports to the United States. It's a repeat in some respects of what they did to the Japanese of cutting off their rare earth exports to Japan in 2010 over a maritime conflict over the Senkaku Islands. So an economy in a large country cannot have or be held captive to an adversary's supply chain that has military ramifications, the building of weapons and aircraft. So there is a strategic as well as an economic part to this. But it really took COVID for Americans to wake up to this. COVID, most of our antibiotics, the precursors, produced in China, like 90-some%, 98% is one of the studies that I had seen, but all of them north of 90%. I don't know what it is today. It's probably a little better, but not a lot. Microelectronics, overwhelming majority from the easy, the very simple to the very complex. Vast majority are from Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and China. All in geographic area, within easy reach of China's ability to embargo or to impact. That's a problem. So supply chains, the trend is to diversify, to build in greater resiliency. So the issue is really resiliency than it is to, it's not a counter China. It's not an anti-China. It's like, okay, we can't have all of our production and supply coming from a country that is not all that friendly. So it's a common sense. It also makes good business sense for the reasons I gave earlier. So, yeah. And every country is going to respond differently. And it's important that each country understand if they're going to partner, their national interests drive them in a shared view, that they understand that. And this is where the tariffs come in hand. The tariffs are forcing very painful but long overdue conversations. It's not purely an economic tool in the current American administration. It's forcing painful conversations that some partner countries would rather avoid and not have at all. And I would leave the final thing I'd say on the answer to this question before I go too far is the concept of reciprocity. Trump's final year in his first term, he started talking about this with press access to China. He's like, hey, we can't have our press going into your country because you put your police and you don't let them interview people. And we're going to start kicking out your press, which we know are state entities. So there was a tit-a-tat. Some may not recall this was going on, but it also included the listing of stocks. Chinese companies were listing stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, absent of meeting the accounting standards for American stocks that were listed on our New York Stock Exchange. So this double standard is no longer politically tenable nor economically sustainable in the United States. So the other thing to kind of look at beyond all this is it's not an anti-China, it's let's get to something fair. The way you treat me is the way I'm going to treat you. And then you have the discussion on the margins as it differs from like U.S. Singapore relations, U.S. China relations versus U.S. French relations, because they're all very different.
Yeah, because I think just recently, I think it's just like 1 or 2 days ago, when China was saying that while it respects all countries' negotiations on the tariffs with the U.S., but at the same time, it also issued a stark warning that any deals that were struck with the U.S. that undermine Beijing's interests, there would be retaliation. It does seem to sort of bring us back into the first Trump administration's era, when there's this thing called do not make us choose type of dilemma that's presented here. So I just want to sort of write onto our discussion and to sort of see your views on that. You might not be really looking into this issue, but based on your understanding of the current administration and its policies, what will be the future approach in trying to mitigate or prevent such a scenario from happening?
Yeah, I'd have to say many of the folks in DC in this administration who I know very much appreciate that they're not trying to force a choice on other countries to say you're either with us or against us. They all understand that. That's not the point. The point is, and that's why it's very bilateral. It's U.S. Singapore, okay? It's U.S. China, it's U.S. Philippines. It's not, hey, U.S. Singapore in this competition with China necessarily. It's about reciprocity, and then the discussion and working out where the margins are in that specific relationship. This is why Trump's first term, he was more focused on bilateral relations, because it was easy to make it mutually beneficial when you're trying to do with two countries rather than a large group. It's also one of the reasons why he walked away from TPP. Hillary Clinton was going to walk away from it anyway, too, because the politics here in the United States were very much against it in 2016, 17. So I digress a little bit. But see, there's more to this, I think, to your question that I want to make sure I hit. Not forcing a choice. I mean, I also come back to my earlier statements about why a maritime approach makes a lot of sense, because it's easy to adjust, like a rheostat, like a knob, like a light dimmer. Okay, if you really want a real bright U.S. Singapore relationship to shine brightly, you can dial the rheostat up, and both countries can say, okay, we want that up to an 8. But if one of the two says, it's gonna have now's not the right time, that's not the right, they can dial that down to a 2. A lot easier to do that with naval forces that are out at sea that can come into port or show up off of bad guys in country to make a point. It's a lot more adjustable, and it can be done in a way that's understood by our partners in the region. So again, this is why the fluid nature of maritime operations, I think, also helps avoid that dilemma, not forcing either explicitly or implied a strategic choice on countries in the region. But all the countries are going to come to their own decision. And again, I go back to, I'm seeing, at least from my vantage point, the Chinese Communist Party is the one forcing the choice.
Yeah, based on what we understand from the past sea power theories from, say, Ken Booth, Jeffrey Till, that the naval instrument is a fungible instrument of statecraft, that it is set in an ambiguous domain or medium, that, the sort of signaling that you give to both your friends and your perceived enemies, could be all taken very differently. And certainly something, it is still, relevant to this day. And with that, of course, the naval instrument is just part of the statecraft. And that, I think, is where Paul's question is very relevant here, because you are asking about, the entire concept of statecraft and whether that requires a strategic foreign government approach, and especially pertaining to the U.S. Navy and across the Pentagon, as well as, the various the U.S. Establishment. So we are able to shed light into how these naval statecraft is being conceived of. I mean, is it just naval instrument? But as you also highlighted in your presentation, there are also other economic aspects. Do you see any other sort of dynamics that you could share from that?
Yeah, I mean, the idea was embraced by the last administration's Secretary of the Navy, and quietly by other elements like the NSA. Sullivan also started to embrace these ideas, and the new team, the new Trump administration, is also embracing this. When you see like the focus on shipping and shipbuilding, that's one piece of a bigger effort. One of the points I would highlight is that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Feinberg, was the CEO of Cerebus. Cerebus was one of the key instruments, the investors, that enabled a buyout of Hanjin Shipyard in Subic Bay that prevented a Chinese takeover back in 2018. He's now the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So this economic, military, naval specifically, kind of dynamic, which is not how U.S. statecraft has been thought of, I'd say, for at least since World War II. This is not how we operate. The right players, and he's not the only one, the NSA, the NSC director, Mike Waltz, also is of this mindset. The blurring of those distinctions in America is starting to become, I think, driven by necessity, but they're starting to appreciate how if you play the economic statecraft in conjunction with the military piece in the right way, a balance, you can actually be more likely to have a positive outcome and strengthen your partnerships at the same time. There was one more piece on this one that I thought was important too. The kind of a cautionary too. But anyway, we'll set that aside. Sorry.
Problem. Maybe we can come back to that once it comes back to you. But I just want to really follow up on this question, which has always been on my mind, because your topic deals with the naval statecraft, and very often we think about things that are pretty kinetic. For example, we think about combat ships, shipbuilding. And of course, there's one thing that has been talked about recently, has sort of seeped into the discourse, is the issue about strategic sea lift, right? This is something that I believe is of great relevance, because if we think about a future conflict in the Pacific, I think this is one key vulnerability that has to be attended to, and there has been quite ample commentaries out there about the current state of the U.S. Strategic sea lift capacity, and whether it is up to scratch in handling, future or even present contingencies. I mean, whether it is going to be, say, a huge, major armed conflict, or even the case of, say, a major, natural calamity that requires, large-scale HADR operations. So I thought this is probably one question I have in mind, whether there has been some thoughts into that, because the impression I got is this area seems to have been neglected in the past in favor of combat combat ships and other kinetic assets.
Yeah, no, the short answer is inadequate. For the United States, its sea lift by itself is inadequate. And it's documented year after year after year, and yet nothing seems to be able to get done with it. But if you add in our allies like the Japanese, South Korean, Singapore, Taiwan, if we get in a conflict, these are the countries that would be on the U.S. We'd all be on the same side, and these are countries that have large shipbuilding and shipping fleets. The Filipinos are one of the largest numbers of merchant mariners across the world. So together, it's still it's comprehensive. The U.S. has a network of partners that could support together, but we don't operate. The problem is we don't think like that. We don't operate our merchant fleets, commercial fleets in a way that we knowingly think about it. So this is something I've been arguing aggressively the last few years to say, look, we need to include access to each other's commercial fleets for sea lift in a crisis or in conflict. Start with the countries that we have treaties with, Japan, Australia, but really Japan and South Korea, top of the list because they are treaty allies who also have large shipbuilding and shipping fleets. And then, of course, our NATO allies, the Italians, the French, the Greeks, also the Danes. There's an interesting new approach and a new urgency because we're not going to be able to build ourselves out of the immediate problem. I mean, that 2027 timeline, that's too soon. We're not going to be able to build the ships. There's no time, no luxury of time to build the military or the sea lift that's going to sustain a lethal force that'll deter the Chinese by doing business as usual. So there's an opportunity there for new partnerships and engage in treaties, quite frankly, new treaties with new partners in this realm. Yeah, shipping is an issue. The United States has less than 80 flagged manned U.S. ships that it can rely on. And in 2019, there were 80,000 port visits. This sustained its peacetime economy. For the military, it needs somewhere upwards of 300 ships. There's a pretty big delta there, difference. And there are no real solutions that are being practiced. So this is where it's a vulnerability not just to the United States, but it's a strategic vulnerability to our treaty allies too. And so it's in their best interest to help work together to find a solution. I think Singapore is a part of that. I think other countries and partners that are not normally thought of as strategic, geostrategic, military kind of like partners to kind of like reframe this to say, look, we can be a partner in the commercial shipping side of this. We can actually be contributing. A lot there to dive into and to figure out. But the gap is so large and time is so short, I can't see any way around it. Yeah. Shipbuilding's got to pick up. That's a whole nother discussion. And I think port infrastructure, repair and refurbishment. Interesting new things are happening with U.S. ships getting work done in India. The U.S. Navy's been visiting ports throughout Southeast Asia to get maintenance done. Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines already in the last 10, 15 years. And that's going to probably continue, probably going to have to grow. So lots of opportunity there, driven by the urgency of the dangers that we're seeing.
Now we have probably enough time for the two last questions here, and Saranya came up with one more question, which I thought is very interesting, and I didn't think about it, and I think now it is probably relevant to sort of discuss about this. Is what do you think has been the progress so far when it comes to addressing cybersecurity issues affecting naval warfare or naval operations writ large?
Yeah, so there's two things. There's the commercial and the shipping, the trade part. And there's also the naval, the gray hull ships, the actual military fight. So I would say not much has changed in the military, the Navy side, at least from the U.S. perspective. It's a threat, it's a danger that's been acknowledged for 25 years. So it's long-standing. Things have been done addressing it, specialized training, capabilities. It's a cat and mouse game. It's a race, aggressor, defense, offense, defense that's going on. So I'd set that and say, not really anything new over there. I mean, things like JADC2, if you follow Navy, networking and stuff, I mean, it's all kind of going on. Interesting, exciting stuff, but nothing really remarkably new or different. That race is continuing. Over in the commercial side, and again, the Chinese Communist Party also wants to keep this competition and this new Cold War cold as well. So one of the ways is try to bankrupt your adversaries, your competitors. One of the ways to do that, and the Chinese have been very effective at this over since the white paper in 1998, when they laid out a plan to dominate the shipping and shipbuilding and the port management globally, is that they effectively can control the terms of trade. What ships can pass through ports that they have a presence or ownership or they manage. The ships on which trade travels, they are the largest shipping nation in the world. I don't separate Hong Kong out on that. And that reality gives them a lot of leverage that has to be kind of considered in the economic. So the cyber side of it is cranes, and also the systems in those ships that China builds. So there was a collision, we'll call it technically an collision in Baltimore Harbor back in March of 2024. Those may be familiar with it. Suspicions are still there that there were electrical problems. Some suspect, and no one really did due diligence by my assessment, to rule out a cyber attack or a cyber contributing factor to the power outages that caused that container ship to run into a major bridge and collapse it and kill 6 people in Baltimore Harbor. So it's a very real threat that people have talked about. I don't think there's enough countermeasures to ensure that we're not vulnerable. There's not enough training to see it and to respond if you're driving a ship like that. There's not enough infrastructure for around these like bridges and piers to prevent like a ship that gets taken over and runs into another pier. So the cyber in the commercial, and then there's the cranes. Some may be familiar with Chinese built cranes. Part of the predictive maintenance is the motors or the cranes will send messages back to the manufacturer in China, ostensibly to say, hey, the gear is about to wear out, another 100 hours of repair or of operations, time to send out a repair crew to go replace one of the bearings. That unfortunately is also a vector for a cyber attack or for espionage. And the US Congress woke up to this last year, and they put a huge amount of money to go through all the cranes in the United States ports to go find and rip out all the modems that were doing this. Many of them never signed in the agreements when the cranes were bought. So the problem is appreciated and is real, to say the least, but it's mostly in the commercial side.
Thank you so much. So just one final word from you, Brent, on what do you foresee or recommend is the message that will be conveyed by Pentagon or Navy leaders at the upcoming Shangri-La dialogue, which is just less than 2 months away?
Oh, yeah. Well, no. Well, I can't predict what, but I would say continuity and highlighting. So one of the other messages I want to make to folks is much of the news, and when I travel to Europe, I traveled to Asia widely. You're only getting one side of American political viewpoints, and it's overwhelmingly Democrat, overwhelmingly left. You're not getting the conservative picture, and the reality is all of these news are biased. So you have to look at both sides. When it comes to perceptions of America, like the Trump administration, often it can be viewed as, oh, America first means no one other than America, or that tariffs are meant to like break others' economies and American domination. That's not the full story. And so I would hope that the message of continuity, which is very real, and again, if you look at Trump's first term, and you judge it on its outcomes, and I would just mention the free and open Indo-Pacific strategic framework actually was influenced by our Japanese allies, and it was actually a Japanese concept that was embraced by the Trump team and made one of their frameworks, and it still lived on through the Biden administration. And so continuity and predictability, don't focus in on the words and what the American press will tell you. There's a continuity there that I think is worth reiterating and focusing people on, because I mean, I get it all the time. Hands are like, oh my God, we're gonna destroy NATO. You're gonna destroy the strategic partnership with the Quad with India, and that um, it's overblown. There is a continuity that I've seen since 2010
Mm,
from Democrat and Republican administrations, and I don't
mm,
see that changing. I would
mm.
hope that would be the message.
Thank you so much, Brent. I hope this is going to be the reassuring message that we will get in less than 2 months' time. I think everyone will be
Yeah.
watching what is going to come, especially if the Secretary of Defense comes and join the discussion. And I think what he's going to share in the keynote or other key addresses is going to be of great concern. And I think on this somewhat cautious but optimistic note, Brent, I couldn't thank you enough for taking so much time of your evening. It is very late into your night on your time zone, and I really hope that you can get a good rest after this. But I will, on behalf of RSIS, on behalf of everyone, I really want to thank you for sparing your time here and sharing so candidly what you know. And of course, special thanks to my colleagues for events, not Amelina, for helping organize all this. And I hope one day we could have you in Singapore to share with us and to interact more with us in person. Until then, Brent, please take good care. And for the rest of you, I hope you have the great rest of the day or evening. I hope to see you again going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.